Good day. Before I get into a discussion of the latest events, the events on the battlefronts in Ukraine, and before I turn once again to the battle of speeches which took place yesterday between President Biden and President Putin, I'd like to discuss a rather interesting and I think in some ways revealing development, which is this open quarrel that is now taking place between the Russian Ministry of Defense and the self-declared creator of the Wagner Group, Wagner organization, and its purported leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin. Now, over the last couple of days, Prigozhin has been making a whole series of statements about the fact that there is supposedly a blockade on supplying ammunition to the Wagner Group, and he's been extremely vocal about this, and it's been getting some attention. And yesterday, finally, the Russian Ministry of Defense responded. Now, the response is very interesting in terms of the quarrel between the Russian Defense Ministry and Prigozhin, and I'm going to come to that in a moment. But for me, the most important part of this response from the Russian Ministry of Defense is what it's actually telling us about the state of the Russian military operation in this war. There's been a lot of claims made about the state of the Russian military, about its supposed ammunition shortages, about the speed of its advances, and whether intentionally or more probably incidentally, this statement by the Russian Ministry of Defense provides a fair amount of information which we can look at and think about and perhaps reflect on when we consider some of the claims that we have seen. First of all, what exactly is it that has been said? What exactly did the Russian Ministry of Defense say? Well, I'm going to read their statement. I'm going to take it from their own site. This is their own translation of their statement, and it reads as follows. Russian Defense Ministry has commented on the exalted statements published on several sources that the munition supplies to volunteers of the assault detachments involved in the liberation of Artyomovsk, that's in other words Bakhmut, are allegedly blocked. Now, I will just stop at this point and say that throughout this statement, the Russian Ministry of Defense does not mention or identify either Prigozhin or the Wagner organization by name. That's perhaps, if you like, one last attempt by the Russian Ministry of Defense to maintain some degree of restraint in its response, but of course it is Prigozhin and the Wagner organization that is being referred to here. And when it talks about the volunteers of the assault detachments involved in the liberation of Artyomovsk, it is, of course, referring to the Wagner Group. Anyway, to continue with the statement, the command of the joint groups of forces pays special, constant, and prioritized attention to providing volunteers and servicemen of assault detachments with all the necessary means within the special military operation. Over the past 48 hours, the assault detachments have advanced a total of over 2.5 kilometers towards the prepared defense positions of the armed forces of Ukraine near Artyomovsk, in other words, Bakhmut. The successful operations would have been impossible without entire fire support provided to the offensive by the artillery, armoured hardware and other firepower of the Yug, I think that means South, group of forces. Despite the difficult weather conditions near Artyomovsk, the ground attack aviation has performed 18 sorties to support the assault detachment's offensives over the recent days. This is why all statements on the lack of ordnance allegedly made by the assault detachments have nothing to do with reality. Thus, within the 48 hours from the 18th to 20th of February, the volunteers of the assault detachments, they mean, I think here, the Wagner groups, had been provided with 1,660 rocket-propelled projectiles for multiple launch rocket systems, 10,171 projectiles for large caliber cannon artillery systems and mortars, 980 projectiles for tanks. All requests for supplying assault detachments are implemented in the shortest possible time. This is the way it has been and will be. In the next few days, all ordnance requests applied for February will be implemented for all assault detachments. Since 25th February, all the range of ordnance will be delivered in accordance with the request applied for March. In total, over the last year, the assault detachment's ordnance demands have been satisfied 140% of requests achieved. This is our priority. We want to reiterate that both volunteers and servicemen of assault detachments are bravely and selflessly liberating Donbass from the Kiev regime's militants, in other words, the Ukrainian army. The attempts to split the mechanism of close cooperation and support between the units of the Russian group of forces are counterproductive and only benefit the enemy. Now, in fairness, I have to say that Prigozhin has issued a fiery response. I'm going to read again part of it. I've been informed that the Ministry of Defense was disseminating information that it was allegedly supplying ammunition to a volunteer unit in the Artyomovsk-Bakhmut direction. Once again, I would like to emphasize that since we have gone to public correspondence with the Ministry of Defense, the Wagner private military company is under-receiving 80% of the ammunition required to perform combat tasks. So the statements of the Defense Ministry are nothing but a mere spit towards the Wagner private military company troops in an attempt to hide their crimes committed in the face of those fighters who are today performing heroic deeds near Bakhmut. As for other volunteer units, there are none in the area of Bakhmut. There is only the Wagner private military company. There is no ammunition. As you may know, gentlemen, from the leadership of the Ministry of Defense, sapper spades have not been supplied yet. If you're going to give us ammunition, then do it rather than telling tales in the media to the Russian people. Denouncing the Ministry of Defense and its statements, I'm ready to submit all documents, including our requisitions and the actual quantities of ammunition and equipment that we received, to the Military Prosecutor's Office or the Military Counterintelligence Service at your choice. I'm ready to do this immediately upon the first request. Now, I'm not going to take Prigozhin's comments entirely seriously. I have to say that he's clearly been, for some time, in some sort of complex argument with the chiefs of the Defense Ministry, and I'm getting the sense that they're becoming increasingly frustrated and angry with him, and the fact that they've published this statement, which he's responded to in this way, shows as much. I don't pretend to know exactly what is going on. I would say, however, that it is inconceivable to me that the Wagner forces would be able to advance in the face of intense Ukrainian resistance in and around Bakhmut if the Wagner organization troops were truly out of ammunition. I don't see how it could be done. And in fact, the reports we get from Ukrainian commanders who are trying to resist Russian advances in Bakhmut, well, they tell us of extremely heavy Russian shelling in this area. But let's now go back to that statement of the Russian Ministry of Defense, because to my mind, as I said, it actually provides a great deal of information about what exactly is going on. Firstly, a couple of days ago, the British Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, gave an interview to the Financial Times in which he said that Russian advances in Ukraine along the battlefronts are measured in meters rather than kilometers. Well, the Russian Ministry of Defense, it claims that in the 48 hours prior to the publication of its statement, which was on the 21st of February, Russian forces in the Bakhmut area advanced over 2.5 kilometers. By the way, I should say that I've also seen a report that over the previous 24 hours, the last 24 hours, Russian forces in the Crimea area have also advanced 4 kilometers. Now, of course, I'm not in a position to confirm that, but that's what the Russian Ministry of Defense is saying. And for what it's worth, I suspect it's probably true. Note that this is an internal quarrel between the Russians, and I don't really see why the Russians would want to lie in a statement like this about a fact like that. The second point I want to make is that at various statements that he's made, Prigozhin has given the impression that the entire fight in and around Bakhmut is being carried out solely by the Wagner organization, that the regular armed forces of Russia are not involved. Well, the Russian Ministry of Defense is at pains to say that this is simply not the case. To quote what they've said again in their statement, the successful operations would have been impossible without entire fire support provided to the offensive by the artillery, armoured hardware and other firepower of the Yug group of forces. In other words, the Wagner organization is part of a team. It is not attacking and capturing Bakhmut single-handed. In other words, it is operating alongside the Russian regular army. However, it is the next section that interests me the most and which I think is the most revealing about the actual state of the war. And this is what the Russian military says about the supplies that the Wagner organization, the volunteers of the assault detachments, have been provided within a 48-hour period from the 18th to the 20th of February. 1,660 rocket-propelled projectiles for multiple rocket launch systems. 10,171 projectiles for large caliber cannon artillery systems and mortars, 980 projectiles for tanks. Now, Ukraine is said to be expending artillery at the rate of about 6,000 rounds a day. We see that over a 48-hour period, the Wagner organization, which is not part of the Russian regular army, has received almost exactly the same amount of artillery, of shells, as the Ukrainian army, the entire Ukrainian army, launches in a day. 1,160 rocket-propelled projectiles, 10,171 rounds of ammunition for artillery systems, large caliber artillery systems and mortars, 980 shells for tanks. Now, that's, as I said, double the amount that the entire Ukrainian army uses up in a day, and just one part of the Russian forces in Ukraine, the Wagner organization, has received double that amount over a 2-day period. So that gives one, I think, a certain feel for the huge discrepancy in firepower between the Russian armies. The Russian military can apparently afford to supply, over a 48-hour period, double the amount of shells to just one component of the Russian forces that are fighting in Ukraine, admittedly the important one, which is the Wagner organization, where double the amount that the Ukrainian army uses in an entire 24-hour period. Now, bear in mind that the shells that we are reading about here, the 10,171 shells provided to the Wagner assault force artillery, the projectiles, the rockets for the multiple rocket launch systems, the tank shells, they are specifically being provided. They're specifically the munitions being provided to the forces of the Wagner organization that are fighting in and around Bakhmut. The Russian army, the Russian Ministry of Defense, is careful to tell us that regular units of the Russian army are also involved, and they are also providing fire support to the Wagner organization troops that are fighting in Bakhmut. And the implication of this commentary, of this statement from the Russian Defense Ministry, is that in fact the greater part of the shelling that is taking place, the greater part of the shelling of Ukrainian forces which is taking place, is being provided not by the artillery of the Wagner organization itself, but by the artillery of the Russian regular army. Now, of course, it could be, and it probably is the case, that the last 48 hours have been particularly intense, and we mustn't make the mistake of thinking that all of the figures that have been given are figures for numbers of shells fired. It's about numbers of shells delivered, which is obviously a different thing. But nonetheless, it gives us a sense of the scale of the challenge that the Ukrainian military is facing as it fights on as it fights the Russians along the contact line. It is massively, hugely outmatched, and I have to say, reading this particular statement of the Russian Ministry of Defense, that reinforces a view which I've had for some time, that the claim that the Russians fire around 20,000 rounds of ammunition a day may be, if anything, an understatement. Probably it is around that on some days. Perhaps it's even less than that on some days. But I suspect that when the fighting becomes particularly intense, it can be much greater and can be up to 60,000 rounds a day, as was reported during the time of the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk fighting back in the summer. So that gives us a sense of the sheer discrepancy in firepower between the two armies. Now, that for me is the most interesting thing to say about this statement from the Russian Ministry of Defense. If I now just go over quickly to Prigozhin's statement, he speaks vehemently that the officials at the Russian Ministry of Defense are lying. He says that they've committed crimes before his fighters, rather emotional language. He also insists, however, that his forces have been provided with no ammunition at all, which I have to say I think is inconceivable. And he also says that he's in a position to provide written documents. He's prepared to provide statements to the military prosecutor's office and the military counterintelligence service to confirm that this is the case. And when he talks about the military counterintelligence service, he is, of course, insinuating that some of the officers in charge of the Russian military are traitors and saboteurs who are working presumably on behalf of Ukraine or of the West. An allegation which those officers are not going to take too kindly at all. Now, I don't believe Prigozhin's statements. I simply make the point that the Russian Defense Ministry has provided actual numbers of shells and munitions. If Prigozhin wanted to provide a credible response, I would suggest that he do the same thing. This very emotional response that he's provided really doesn't, it seems to me, refute the points that the Russian Ministry of Defense is making. I'm going to say something now about Prigozhin. I think that he is getting way over his head. First of all, I'm going to express my own view. I don't think he is the real head of the Wagner organization. I've checked his biography, which is an interesting one. He's served time in prison and all that, but there is no evidence that he's ever served in the military that I can see. He has no military background himself. He has no knowledge or experience in commanding troops. He's never been in any military school or academy that I know of. So he's clearly not the overall commander of the Wagner organization. And though he is undoubtedly and indisputably a very wealthy man indeed, he is not, I think, wealthy enough to operate single-handed an organization like the Wagner organization. I think doing that is way beyond his reach. Undoubtedly, he is involved in setting it up. I've said that he's somebody who's served time. It's a well-known fact that the Wagner organization has, until fairly recently, it's stopped doing it for the moment, but until fairly recently, it regularly recruits young men from prisons. And I wonder whether that was partly why he was brought in when the Wagner organization was set up. As I've discussed in the past, I can think one could perhaps see it as a kind of Russian equivalent to the French Foreign Legion, a force that Russia can deploy rapidly in many locations around the world, a force made up of highly experienced officers and NCOs, a force which trains the soldiers who fight in it to an extremely high standard. All those things, it seems to me, must imply that it works alongside the Russian military and that it's part, ultimately, of the Russian military, even if, for the time being, the fiction exists that it is separate to the Russian military. I mean, it's even able to operate tanks and Sukhoi 24 supersonic fighter bombers. So I can't imagine that it would be able to do these things if it did not have a very intimate connection indeed with the Russian regular army. But Prigozhin has been a useful figurehead, and he's been also, as I said, a very effective recruiter in Russian prisons, amongst the Russian prison population. And he's a colourful character, and he's somebody who perhaps somebody in the Russian Ministry of Defense thought might be an attractive person to head an organization like this. He's also supposedly got some kind of links to Putin himself, though I have to say that the evidence for that seems to me incredibly threadbare. But anyway, putting all that aside, I think that he is not the true leader of the Wagner organization. I think, though, he's come to think of himself in that kind of a way. I think he's now trying to leverage the Wagner organization to gain prominence and importance. And I think all of this is going a bit to his head. And I think he's now saying things which are extremely unwise and which, when this conflict has ended, could find him in very serious trouble indeed. Certainly, he is now making enemies of some extremely powerful people in the Russian Defense Ministry, I suspect in the broader Russian government. And I think that if he's not very careful, if he continues making the kind of emotional statements that he's just made in response to the statement issued by the Russian Defense Ministry, then, as I said, he could find himself eventually in serious trouble. But I'm not going to spend any more time discussing Prigozhin. Let me repeat again, the key things to take away from this Ministry of Defense statement, the ones that for me stand out are these. When the Russians advance, sometimes they do advance in kilometers, not in meters, as Ben Wallace claimed in his interview to the Financial Times. It's not always the case. It's not so on every part of the battlefronts. It doesn't happen every day, but sometimes it does, and it's happening on an irregular basis in and around Bakhmut. Secondly, the fighting in Bakhmut is not just hordes of Wagner troops storming the city all by themselves. It's a complex operation, to a great extent controlled and supervised by the Russian military, and regular Russian military units are undoubtedly involved in carrying it out, even if there's been a sort of unspoken agreement up to now to let the Wagner organization get the lion's share of the credit. And last but not least, in fact, most important of all, we've now just had an inside look at the level of munitions that the Russian military is able to supply to its troops on the battlefield. And we see how massively those outmatch those available to Ukraine. So that's what I wanted to say about this very interesting exchange. No doubt there'll be more of it further on. But anyway, let's move on to what's actually been happening on the battlefronts. Well, there's been a lot of fighting, apparently, in and around Bakhmut. The Russians are pressing hard. The Wagner assault forces at their vanguard, unquestionably, to try and capture this town of Berchova, which is, as I said, the next settlement in the line Krasnaya Gora, Paraskovievka. Berchova is the next one. Once Berchova is taken, the roads leading into Bakhmut become, from what I can understand, completely unusable. And Ukraine is then reduced to its country lanes and fields if it's going to continue to keep its troops in Bakhmut fighting. And there's been more reports now that the fighting has indeed reached the very center of Bakhmut. There's also reports that a major factory within the industrial area of Bakhmut in the north is now coming under attack. Ukraine likes to convert these factories into heavily defended fortifications, and no doubt there'll be a bitter fight for this particular factory. But of course, if Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut are starting to run out of supplies and ammunition, then their ability to cling on to this factory starts to dim. And elsewhere on the battle lines, as I said, we've got more reports of more Russian advances in the Kremenaya area. 4 kilometers, allegedly. This is, by the way, come from a Ukrainian source, that the Russians have pushed forward 4 kilometers in the Kremenaya area. I'm not exactly certain where that is, and they're pushing further towards Kupiansk. And yesterday, I also reported the fact that the Russians seem to be deploying around 5,000 men to the Vuhledar area to join the forces which have been fighting there. And no doubt, at least I expect, that there will be a further assault on Vuhledar at some point within the next coming days. Now, the big question is this all the Russian winter offensive? And I'm making this observation because there's been another outstanding video in the outstanding series of videos published by Brian Beletic on the new Atlas. And Brian Beletic references an article co-written by Michael Kaufman, who, as I say, is a strongly pro-Ukrainian military commentator and analyst, but someone whom I take extremely seriously. I think on many occasions he's been a very insightful commentator and has been so, by the way, for a long time, since long before the start of this war. Michael Kaufman thinks that the Russian winter offensive is already underway. It's been proceeding in a slow, incremental fashion, as he says, but this is supposedly the Russian winter offensive, and Michael Kaufman says that this is a huge mistake, and it's all based upon the assumption that the Russians ought to instead be staying on the defensive, building up their forces, and by going on the attack now, allegedly under pressure from the Kremlin, the Russians are losing lives and equipment at a huge rate. This is what Kaufman seems to think, and thus they're weakening themselves in advance of the Ukrainian spring offensive, which is to come. Now, Brian Beletic takes a completely different view. He says that this isn't actually a big winter offensive. It is rather a case of the Russians putting pressure on every part of the front line, keeping the Ukrainians overstretched and overextended, burning up Ukrainian soldiers and munitions, preventing the Ukrainians building up their forces in the rear, so that weakening thereby any offensive that Ukraine does launch in the future. Now, on this argument, I come down entirely on Brian Beletic's side, and I say this even though at one point, back before the new year, I did think that the Russians probably were going to launch some kind of offensive over the course of the winter. But the facts actually, and let's put aside speculations, let's focus instead on facts. The facts tell a different story. The number of Russian troops involved in all of these attacks is relatively small, and most of the units that have been involved are the same units that have been fighting in this conflict zone ever since the start of the present period of the fighting back in February last year. We're not seeing vast columns of armoured vehicles and tanks. We aren't seeing huge numbers of infantry being thrown into the battle. Only yesterday, I said that one Ukrainian official said that there were 190 battalions of Russian troops stationed now in Donbass, in the Donetsk area. Well, they are not engaged in any particular fighting at the moment. The number of troops who are going to be deployed, apparently, in and around Vuhledar, which, as I said, is a major point of the Ukrainian defense forces. Well, we've just been told that they're going to be reinforced by around 5,000 men. That's about a reinforced brigade's worth. Hardly the stuff of giant offensives. And in Bakhmut, all the indications are that the forces that have been deployed there have been reinforced, they have got stronger, but not by orders of magnitude. What has been happening is that the Russians have conducted a kind of siege war, operation in and around Bakhmut. They've gradually been breaking the Ukrainian defenses, and that's enabling them to incrementally win the Battle of Bakhmut. So, given that this is so, I have to say that I agree with Brian Beletic's view. This is the Russians keeping the Ukrainians under constant pressure, not allowing the Ukrainians time to build up stocks of ammunition, not allowing the Ukrainians time to build up large reserves of troops in their rear, weakening whatever offensive Ukraine does eventually launch over the next few weeks and months. I am going to say one thing, though, which is slightly in conflict with what Brian Beletic says. It's not really in conflict. I mean, it complements him. I do think that the Russians are indeed where they are pushing forward in order to realize specific objectives. For example, I think that it is undoubtedly the Russian objective to capture Bakhmut, just as before it was undoubtedly the Russian objective to take Soledar. I think the Russians want to take Bakhmut. They want to capture the hills to the west of Bakhmut. They want to be in a position where they can put their artillery on those hills and start shelling Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, the next Ukrainian defense line, the last Ukrainian defense line in Donbass. So I think that is what the Russians are generally seeking to do in Bakhmut. In other words, this is a real Russian advance in Bakhmut, not just an attempt to keep the Ukrainians busy, overextended, overstretched, to degrade their forces in Bakhmut. Though that does, of course, play a significant role in this. And the same is true in Vuhledar. This has been a difficult fight for the Russians, capturing Vuhledar. It's been also, by the way, a difficult fight for the Russians in the Marinka area, which is connected to Vuhledar. But I do think that the Russians do intend eventually to capture Vuhledar and to break Ukrainian defenses in and around Donetsk city. This is not going to be the work of some big arrow offensive. It's going to be the work of steady siege tactics of the kind that we've seen. The ones around Vuhledar, particularly difficult because Vuhledar is the high ground and it's difficult to capture, therefore, and there's no doubt at all that the Russians have suffered losses there, but eventually, no doubt, they will capture Vuhledar, just as eventually they will capture Bakhmut. And in the Kremenaya area, I think it's a little different. I think that the Russians have probably calculated that whatever offensive Ukraine launches is not going to be so much in the Kremenaya-Svatovo area. It's more likely to happen in the south, towards the Sea of Azov. After all, that's what the Ukrainians are telling us. But here again, I think that the major purpose of the pressure the Russians are putting on the Ukrainians is to gain ground, definitely, to degrade Ukrainian troops, to grind them down, in other words, but also to improve the Russian defensive position in this part of the conflict area, to restore the Oskol River line, for example, which could mean capturing Kupiansk, to push Ukrainian defensive forces back beyond Kremenaya, to, in other words, make any Ukrainian attack in this part of the conflict zone more difficult than the one that the Ukrainians launched back in September, when the Ukrainians were able to attack in Kharkiv region against heavily depleted Russian troops, a very reduced number of Russian troops. So that's my own personal view. Overwhelmingly, as I said, I agree with Brian Beletic about this. I don't think that this is a this is the big Russian offensive. I think this is more a case of putting pressure, as he says, on the battle lines, keeping the Ukrainians engaged, grinding them down. But I do make those qualifications that I've just said, which I don't actually think detract from Brian Beletic's overriding underlying point. I would just again reiterate that I don't know what the Russians are planning. And one other point Brian Beletic has made, which is absolutely correct, it's fully sound, is that no Russian official, and I think I could say this, he's speculating about this a little, but I can confirm, I think, with fair confidence that what he's saying is true. No Russian official at any level, not Putin, not the defense minister, Shoigu, not Surovikin, the probable theater commander, not General Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff, none of the officials, the top officials of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, not the officials in Kherson and Zaporozhye region. None of them have spoken about some grand winter offensive by the Russians. Some of these officials from the four regions have discussed particular advances that are taking place, but it's clear that they're not talking about the kind of great grand offensive that Michael Kaufman is to some extent talking about. And again, just as a piece of history, and we are talking about a military, the Russian military, which is deeply historically minded, as by the way the Russian political class also is. I would just say again that in 1943, the tactics of building up defenses, strengthening one's forces, piling up reserves was exactly what the Russians did, in the knowledge that the Germans would launch an offensive, and the Germans did duly launch an offensive at a place called Kursk, and the Russians blunted that offensive, and it was once they blunted that German offensive that the Russians felt able to go on the attack. Obviously, the scale is completely different, but perhaps the strategy is approximately the same. Now, I would say I have just received, just shortly before I started making this program, an absolutely masterly discussion of Russian tactics from a former NATO intelligence officer, somebody who served in various armies. I'm not going to give away anything further about the identity of this person, but he's pointed out to me that during the Cold War, Soviet strategy was for a very rapid offensive indeed, covering 30 kilometers a day with huge armored forces on NATO's central front, aiming for presumably the British Channel, the Channel. And today, the Russians are conducting operations in a different way to that. They're instead conducting an artillery war, an attrition war, and that is what explains also their build-up of reserves. And this enormous build-up of reserves enables the Russians to counter whatever steps the other side is making, as well as to develop the plans to develop their own plans. And this former NATO intelligence officer is also somewhat skeptical, perhaps he would put it stronger than that, about all the talk about the Ukrainians converting to some kind of flexible defense or operation strategy using fewer guns, less artillery, emphasizing instead mobile war. And as I take him to say, and this is only on a very cursory reading of his email, in reality, very few NATO armies actually train that way. Well, I think before I discuss this further, I'd like to read this email more properly, and I might have some more questions to ask of this person. But anyway, I may very well come back to that in my next program. So that's where we are on the battlefront. Still Russians grinding down in Bakhmut, and we see from the Russian Defense Ministry's statement in response to Prigozhin, the scale of the forces that have been deployed there, continuing to grind down Ukrainian defenses in Bakhmut. Apparently, according to the Ukrainians themselves, pushing forward in Crimea and taking a hardened look at Vuhledar and apparently reinforcing there. And by the way, even as I'm making this video, there's also some reports coming through of a further Russian missile strike across Ukraine, which I'll have to assess in my next program. Let's turn instead now to the battle of the speeches. Now, yesterday I did give a summary account of President Putin's speech to the Federal Assembly, what you might call a State of the Nation address. But of course, yesterday also saw a speech by President Biden at the castle in Warsaw. Now, I have read the speech and I listened to it, but I've read the speech, the transcript of the speech provided by the White House website. By the way, as it regularly does, the White House website leaves in President Biden's verbal fluffs, his inability, for example, to pronounce correctly the word Finlandization, and other sort of fluffs like that. I don't know why that's done, by the way, because it does create a rather odd impression when reading the transcript. But anyway, put all that aside. Anyway, I've read it and I've listened to this speech, and two things stand out to me. Firstly, the extraordinarily vituperative comments made in this speech, insulting comments made about Putin, about Russia's leader. And the speech is full of them. I'm not going to go through the speech, and I'll say why in a moment. But President Biden makes lots of claims about Putin. He calls him the dictator. He calls him a dictator. He talks about this being part of, some conflict between autocracies. He talks about Ukraine fighting for freedom and all of those sort of things. But extraordinary, insulting language about Putin, whose mind, by the way, he pretends to read. He tells us what President Putin's strategies and tactics were at the start of the conflict, about what it was that President Putin supposedly intended to do in and around Kiev. I'm not going to get into all of that. But anyway, these immensely vituperative words are in stark contrast to Putin's approach in his speech to the Federal Assembly. In that speech, President Putin didn't mention by name a single Western leader. He didn't mention Biden, he didn't mention Obama, he didn't mention Trump, he didn't mention George W. Bush, he didn't talk about Boris Johnson or Olaf Scholz or Emmanuel Macron or Giorgia Meloni or Ursula von der Leyen or Habeck and Baerbock or any of these people. He talks about the West. He talks about the policies that the West follows. He can be extremely critical of those things. He endeavors, however, to be analytical rather than abusive. And as I said, he is not personally insulting. It's a very strange contrast. And I have to admit, here, unequivocally, I prefer Putin's approach. It seems to me that if one day you're going to have to sit down and talk to people, which is possible, then it doesn't make much sense to insult them. And I'm going to say something else. I think around the world, this contrast will be noticed, and people will feel that Putin gave overall a dignified and measured speech, which did not sink to the level of abuse and vituperation that one got from President Biden. The other thing I have to say, and it's, I'm afraid, an inevitable point, is that President Biden didn't actually say very much. I mean, there were lots and lots of words, and there were lots and lots of words during his comments, during his visit to Kiev. There was nothing really new. In fact, there wasn't anything. I mean, it seemed at times, at least to me, others are free to disagree with me, but it seemed to me, as always with President Biden, as always with far too many American leaders nowadays, simply a recitation of cliches and tropes. Ukraine is valiant, it's defending itself, it's free. Putin is, pursuing some dark strategy of aggression. This is his war. He's fighting against democracy. Ukraine is a democracy. It's very much like this. But it didn't actually contain any announcements. It didn't give any explanation of what the strategy or what the planning is. President Biden did say that Ukraine would win, but he didn't really say how it would win. He said that there would be lots of tragedies and victories. And he said that Ukraine was going to go through some very difficult times. But this was all said in a very sketchy way. There was no real discussion or analysis of the conflict or of what's going on, or what his own President Biden's strategy is, or what is the strategy of the United States, or what victory amounts to, what President Biden's conception of victory is. There was nothing. There was a soundbite, and it's a soundbite which I see is now being repeated by a lot of people. I saw it being used by Annalena Baerbock a little while back, which is that if Russia pulls its troops out of Ukraine, not quite clear what that means, by the way. Does it include Crimea? I presume yes. But if Russia pulls out of Ukraine, pulls its troops out of Ukraine, the war ends. If Ukraine stops defending itself, Ukraine ends. Now, that's not a strategy or a policy statement. As I said, that's just a soundbite. And for the record, I think it's completely wrong. I think that if the Russians pulled all their troops out of Ukraine, if they pulled out of Crimea as well, it would not be the end of the conflict. It would just mark another stage in the conflict with the Ukrainians marching in, occupying all of these areas, probably against the resistance of the local people, many of the local people. There would be a huge exodus of people. There would be, in other words, another wave of suffering on top of all the suffering that we've seen up to now. But perhaps it's the second sentence, the second part of this soundbite, that is the most problematic. If Ukraine stops defending itself, then Ukraine ends. Now, the first thing to say about that is that that looks like a formula for perpetual war. It's not suggesting some kind of proposal. It doesn't tell us how Ukraine can find some way of ending this war short of a total unachievable victory. But let's put that aside, because I actually think that the whole idea is wrong. We've had successive peace plans. We had the Minsk Agreement. We had the draft agreement that was almost agreed in Istanbul last year. All of these agreements would have enabled Ukraine to survive. Well, it would have lost some territory. In the case of the Minsk Agreement, it would have had to concede the autonomy of Donbass, which is not, properly speaking, a loss of territory at all, but probably the outcome of the Istanbul Agreement would have been a loss of some territory, but that would have been limited to Crimea and Donbass. This is not a formula for ending Ukraine. So if Ukraine had agreed to this plan and had, in effect, ceased defending itself as part of some kind of overall peace agreement with the Russians, which would, of course, have involved a ceasefire, it would not have been the end of Ukraine. It would have been a mechanism, a formula for ensuring the survival of Ukraine. Whereas perpetual war, which is what this sentence implies, it seems to me, does risk the eventual destruction of Ukraine. We already see how many thousands of Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. We see photographs of Ukrainian cemeteries. There's a huge photograph on the New York Times, I believe today, showing a Ukrainian cemetery. And by the way, the article that goes along with it says that in order to stop this, we must actually give Ukraine even more weapons, which, as I said, I'm not even going to start on the whole illogic of that. But we see tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands perhaps, of Ukrainian soldiers having been killed in the fighting. We see Ukraine using territory. It's lost much more of Donbass. It's lost significant part of Zaporozhye region. It's lost the eastern part of Kherson region. And the Russians now have claims to the rest of Donetsk region, that is still under Ukrainian control. They have claims to the rest of Zaporozhye region. They ultimately claim and apparently intend to reoccupy West Bank, Kherson region as well. And of course, if the war continues beyond this, if the Russians are allowed to go on grinding down the Ukrainian army, killing more Ukrainians, causing more tragedies for the Ukrainian people, well, of course, the Russians will be able as well to push on, take more of Ukraine, and perhaps eventually all of Ukraine east of the Dnieper. It's not impossible. In which case, of course, Ukraine's position becomes more difficult. And then, of course, if the Russians push on even further, if they push on beyond the Dnieper, well, you can eventually see a situation where Ukraine ceases to exist as a state. I think that's the Russian plan. It was certainly not the Russian plan when the conflict began. But to reiterate again, if you persist with perpetual war, which is what President Biden is talking about, then you do generally risk the survival of Ukraine. A surely better way forward is for the United States instead to press for some kind of diplomatic settlement, which would mean that Ukraine would survive even if it would have to give up some of its territory, some of its post-1991 territory. Well, there we go. Now, the other thing to say about President Biden's speech is that, as I've said previously, he came empty-handed. I'm not going to go over a discussion over the latest US arms package, but Brian Beletic has done that extremely effectively for the new Atlas. It was meager fare, it's the thinnest arms package that the United States has put together up to now. Frankly, I would have thought that the Ukrainians would be deeply disappointed that this is all that President Biden was able to come up with on a trip to Kiev and to Warsaw, where he made all of those speeches. And of course, it doesn't help the overall credibility of this particular visit that it's now been confirmed that by the United States that not only were the Russians informed in advance that President Biden was intending to visit Kiev over the course of this European visit tour, but that he actually sought permission from the Russians to go, and that the Russians even set conditions on what kind of personnel, what kind of aircraft could be used if President Biden did, in fact, visit Kiev. John Helmer at Dancing with Bears has a good discussion of this. So overall, I thought it was an underwhelming visit. I've noticed that President Biden's speech is already disappearing from the newspapers. It was clearly not the great historic address like the one that, say, President Kennedy made in 1961 in Berlin. It is a speech, or rather a series of speeches, that is forgettable, that broke new ground, but which perhaps by adopting this rather foolish soundbite is creating problems for the future. Now, the contrast again with Putin's speech is remarkable because, of course, Putin's speech was full of facts and figures and discussions about Russia's future. He was discussing, for example, a significant overhaul of the higher education system, the upgrading of the vocational system, which apparently he says is already improving significantly in Russia. He was talking about the strengthening of the Russian economy. He was outlining all sorts of measures about the strengthening of the Russian economy. And he also, it struck me, for the first time, appeared to concede a point which I have made many times in the past, and which my late friend, John Hellervig, perhaps the best commentator of the Russian economy that I can remember, used to make continuously until he passed away, tragically some years ago, that the single thing that's holding the Russian economy back has been the fact that the central bank has been conducting an over-tight monetary policy, draining the economy of liquidity at a time when the finance ministry, the Russian finance ministry, has been insisting on running a budget deficit. Well, Putin, for the first time, appeared to come close to acknowledging that this was the case when he said that in future, with inflation brought under control, interest rates would become softer, lower, and that would enable more credit in the economy, more liquidity in the economy, which would allow the economy finally to start growing faster than it has done. That was an interesting statement, I thought, from him, and we'll see whether the central bank follows up on it. By the way, and in parenthesis, the finance ministry, the Russian finance ministry, says that they anticipate a 2% budget deficit this year. I say that this is, in a way, a sequel to my earlier comments about the deficit in the Russian budget that took place in January. But let's put all that aside. The single thing that came across most interestingly for me from Putin, however, is of how very limited the effect of the sanctions has been on Russia's real economy. He said that the only period in 2022 when the economy, the Russian economy, actually experienced contraction was in the second quarter. In the third and fourth quarters, the economy bounced back into growth, and of course it had grown strongly in the first quarter. So the sanctions created a brief shock, but they weren't the knockout blow that virtually everybody, including many people in Russia, had expected that they would be. Anyway, the two speeches did make, for me, an extraordinary contrast. One speech full of analysis. You might not always agree with the analysis, but there it is, full of policy decisions, full of facts and figures and statistics, full of plans for the future of his country. Much more detailed plans, by the way, than the ones that President Biden discussed in his State of the Union address before Congress a few weeks ago. But anyway, a lot of that in Putin's speech. And as I said, this windy rhetoric coming from President Biden over the course of his trips to Kiev and Warsaw. Well, we shall see how this war ends. We shall see what happens over the next few days and weeks. And this is the point, however, where I stop. It's already been another long video, and there'll be more from me soon. And in the meantime, just to remind you again, you can find all our videos on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Telegram, and of course Rockfin. And you can support our work if you wish via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. And you can check out our shop and buy yourselves the great things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all of those things. And last but not least, if you have liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.